Okay, imagine this scenario. You're trying to figure out how people might react to a new product, maybe.
Mm.
And you want to hear from specific groups, like, say, a Gen Z woman with impaired vision. Or maybe you just want to understand the different opinions across, I don't know, race or gender lines.
Right, getting those diverse viewpoints.
Exactly. And with AI being so powerful now, it feels really tempting, maybe even efficient, to just ask an LLM, tell me what it's like to be this person, or what would this group think?
Bam, getting that quick insight.
You're looking for that diversity fast,
Mm.
right?
And well, that's not just a thought experiment anymore, is it? We're actually seeing this happen.
Really?
Yeah, LLMs, large language models, are being proposed, sometimes even used as sort of stand-ins for real people.
Yeah.
In research, user testing, social science studies, even trying to get a feel for public opinion.
Wow.
The idea, the assumption is that because they've been trained on just unbelievable amounts of text, they must somehow absorb or be able to simulate all these different human experiences and identities.
But hang on a second. Because the source material we're diving into today, it's centered around this really important academic paper. It's in Nature Machine Intelligence.
Oh, yeah. Wang, Morgenstern, and Dickerson, a significant piece of work.
Totally. And it basically throws a huge wrench into that whole idea. Their research gives some pretty solid evidence that using the LLMs we have now to represent diverse people isn't just, tricky.
Yeah.
It actually risks causing real harm.
Absolutely. So that's our mission for this deep dive, right? We're going to dig into this paper. We want to understand why this research team says these LLMs have fundamental limits here.
Okay.
And explore the specific kinds of harm they actually identified. And crucially, look at the innovative ways they studied this. Their methods were pretty rigorous.
Good. So the goal is, when you finish listening, you'll have a really clear idea of what these models can realistically do, and maybe more importantly, what they can't do when it comes to representing diverse humans, and why that distinction matters so much. All right, let's get into it. The core problem they found. It seems to hit right at how these LLMs are actually built and trained. Why can't these incredibly sophisticated models, fed all this text, just accurately simulate different perspectives?
Well, it boils down to some fundamental things about their training, the process itself and the data. Think about that enormous data set they learned from all that text scraped from the internet.
Yeah, massive.
It is massive. But what's usually missing, critically missing, is reliable information about who wrote it, the author's identity.
Okay. So the model sees the words, the patterns, all that, but it has no real clue who wrote it or what their actual lived experience was.
Precisely. So if the training data has text that mentions, say, black woman or person with impaired vision, that phrase is just as likely, maybe even more likely, to be in a sentence written by someone outside that group talking about them,
Right.
as it is to be text written by someone inside that group sharing their own authentic perspective.
And that disconnect, that lack of linkage between the words and the actual lived experience, that's the root of their first major finding, the one they call misportrayal.
Exactly right, misportrayal. That's when an LLM, when you prompt it to respond as someone with a specific identity, it ends up generating text that reflects sort of the outgroup's view or common stereotypes about that group.
Instead of the real deal.
Instead of capturing the nuance, the authentic in-group self-representation that people in that group actually share. It's kind of like asking someone to describe walking in another person's shoes, but all they've ever done is see a picture of the shoes from far away.
That sounds, well, incredibly problematic, especially if we're talking about groups that are already marginalized or often misrepresented.
It is, and the paper really leans into this. They connect this technical limitation directly to, real historical harms, the whole practice of speaking for others, which has this long, damaging history of basically silencing marginalized voices, cementing social power structures. So if we build tech that inherently talks about groups using these external views rather than centering their own voices...
We risk just repeating those same old patterns.
Exactly. We risk perpetuating those injustices, what some philosophers call epistemic injustice, where someone's knowledge or experience is unfairly dismissed just because of who they are.
Wow. Is there an example from the study that really makes this misportrayal clear?
Yeah, there's a striking one. They prompted an LLM to respond as a person with impaired vision, talking about immigration.
Okay.
Now, the actual human participants with impaired vision shared all sorts of perspectives, grounded in their lives.
Okay.
But the LLM, it generated text like something along the lines of, well, I may not be able to visually observe the nuances of the border or read statistics, I believe. See, It immediately defaults to this stereotypical external view, focusing only on the visual limitation. It completely misses the actual varied concern someone with impaired vision might genuinely have about immigration, which likely have nothing to do with their vision itself.
That really hits home. And they found this misportrayal was worse for certain groups.
Yeah, they noted it was particularly pronounced for groups that are already less represented in big data sets, or whose public portrayal is often dominated by outsiders talking about them. Think non-binary individuals, people with impaired vision.
Groups whose voices are already often quieted.
Right. The harm gets amplified.
But the researchers, they were thorough. They didn't just point out the problem. They actually tested ways to maybe lessen the issue, even if not solve it completely.
Yes, and that's a really key part of the study's contribution, I think. It wasn't just critique. They did empirical tests of potential solutions. One thing they tried was using identity-coded names in the prompt.
Instead of the label.
Yeah. So instead of saying respond as a black person, they might use a name that's statistically more common in that demographic, like the paper used Darnell Pierre as an example.
Interesting. Did that actually help?
They found it could help, especially for getting responses that seemed more aligned with in-group views for black men and women.
Huh. Any idea why?
Their guess, their hypothesis, was that maybe names are slightly more likely to be linked to actual author information in the training data than just generic labels like women or black person.
Oh, okay.
But interestingly, they said it didn't work as well for white identities. Maybe because white is often treated as the default, the unmarked category in a lot of data.
So it's like a potential workaround maybe, but it's still kind of tangled up in the biases of the data itself, not a real fix for how the model understands identity.
Exactly. It's more of a data-dependent trick than a fundamental architectural solution.
Okay, so misportrayal is about generating text about a group from the outside. What's the second big problem they identified? Group flattening.
Right, group flattening. This one's about the lack of variety within the responses you get for a single identity. LLMs tend to crank out answers that are just too similar, too homogeneous. They fail to capture that rich diversity of perspectives and experiences that naturally exists within any group of people who share an identity. Any large group has tons of internal variation. LLMs tend to just collapse all that down.
Into one narrow view.
Pretty much, into a single sort of average representation.
And the academic reason for that also ties back to the training.
It does. Specifically, it connects to the mathematical goals, the objective functions used when training these models. Very often they use something called likelihood loss functions, like cross-entropy.
Okay. What does that mean in practice?
It means the model gets rewarded, heavily rewarded, for predicting the single most probable next word, given the words that came before. Now, that's crucial for making the language fluent and making sense.
Yeah, you want it to sound like real language.
Right. But it also inherently pushes the model towards the statistical average, the most common predictable response.
So it's basically incentivized to play it safe, to give the most average answer, which ends up erasing all the interesting variations and subgroups within the main identity.
That's a great way to put it. The training objective naturally discourages generating responses that might be totally valid, totally authentic for some people within that group, but just happen to be statistically less common in the massive training data set. The paper used the example of black women and white women. While both are women, their experiences can be very different. An LLM prompted just with woman might gloss over those crucial distinctions.
The harm there seems just as serious. It's like reinforcing a stereotype, but this time it's a stereotype of sameness within the group.
Absolutely. Marginalized groups have historically been painted with these broad, simplistic brushes, right?
Yeah.
Treated as monolithic. If LLMs just reinforce that by giving this flattened, homogeneous picture, they're actively working against recognizing important in-group differences.
Makes intersectionality impossible too, presumably.
Exactly. It makes it really hard to represent how different parts of someone's identity intersect to create unique experiences. The non-binary example they used was powerful here.
What was that?
The human participants who identified as non-binary shared this really wide range of experiences about family, work, health, all sorts of things. But the LLMs prompted as non-binary, they often got stuck on just one thing: pronoun issues, almost exclusively.
Wow. Talk about flattening.
Yeah.
So, again, did the researchers look at ways to maybe encourage more diversity in the output, like push the model away from the average?
They did. They experimented with a common technique, adjusting the temperature setting during text generation.
Temperature, I've heard of that. Increasing it makes the output more random, right?
Basically, yeah. Higher temperature makes the model's word choices less predictable, less tied to only the most probable options. It generally leads to more varied, sometimes more creative output.
Okay, so did turning up the heat solve the flattening problem?
Well, the study found it could increase certain kinds of diversity. Like, you'd get more unique sequences of words, more unique enneagrams in the text.
Oh, there's a catch.
There's a big catch.
Yeah.
They found that to get the enneagram diversity anywhere close to human levels, you had to crank the temperature up so high that the generated text often became just rambling, nonsensical, incoherent.
Not exactly useful.
Not really. And even at those super high, often nonsensical temperatures, the model's responses still didn't match the diversity of the human responses when they measured it using more sophisticated methods.
Like looking at the actual meaning.
Exactly. Using things like expert embeddings, which measures semantic similarity, how similar the meaning is between different texts. Even with high temperature, the range of meaning wasn't as diverse as what the humans provided.
Okay, so temperature might shuffle the words around more, but it doesn't magically create a wider range of genuinely distinct, meaningful perspectives.
That's the takeaway. It doesn't fix the underlying problem that the model is trained to converge on the most probable stuff.
Right. So we've got misportrayal, the external viewpoint problem, and group flattening, the homogeneity problem. The third limitation they identified, identity essentialization, feels a bit different.
It is slightly different. The paper presents this one not just as a technical side effect, but almost as a harm built into the very idea of prompting an LLM with an identity label.
How so?
Well, the act of telling the model, respond as a insert identity here, implicitly treats that identity as if it's some fixed, definable set of characteristics that the model can just embody.
Like reducing a complex, fluid human identity down to a simple checklist of traits.
Precisely. You're asking the model to perform an identity, which reinforces the notion that these identities are static things defined by predictable attributes.
And why is that harmful?
Because it can make demographic differences seem inherent essential, maybe even unbridgeable. It amplifies the perception of difference between groups based on these simplified, rigid stereotypes.
Okay.
The paper had some subtle examples from GPT-4. Prompting it as black woman led to greetings like, hey girl, hey sis, oh honey. Prompting as white man got, hey buddy, hey friend, hey mate. Those aren't just random words. They reflect stereotypical linguistic patterns the model picked up, triggered by the identity prompt itself. It essentializes the identity down to these linguistic tics.
Okay, this idea of essentialization, it actually connects to another really innovative part of their study, doesn't it? Where they looked at alternatives to using demographic prompts.
Yes, exactly. And this, I think, is a major academic contribution of the paper. First, they categorized why someone might want to use identity in the first place. They came up with 4 reasons for prompting or using identity data.
Okay, what are they?
Let's see, R1 contingent. This is where identity is truly necessary. It determines the truth. Like asking, what is your experience as? This is the highest stakes use case for trying to replace humans.
Makes sense.
R2 relevant. Identity is relevant, maybe influences things, but doesn't strictly determine the truth. Like asking political opinions where identity might correlate.
Okay.
R3 subjective. This is for tasks where identity might influence subjective judgments, like content moderation or labeling how positive or negative a piece of text is.
Got it. And the last one?
R4 coverage. This is where you're using identity simply to get a range of different responses, maybe for brainstorming, testing different user reactions, just getting broader representation in your data without needing specific people's unique stories.
And they focused on that last one, R4 coverage, to explore alternatives.
Exactly. Their insight was, if your goal is just to get a variety of responses, R4, do you really need to use sensitive demographic labels that risk all these harms? Misportrayal, flattening, essentialization.
Good question.
They tested prompting the models using non-demographic characteristics instead, things like Myers-Briggs personality types, or using personas people created on places like Reddit, or even just political leaning.
That's really clever. What did they find? Did it work?
They found that these alternative prompts, the Myers-Briggs, the personas, the politics, could actually achieve similar or sometimes even higher response coverage, meaning they generated a wider variety of distinct perspectives.
Than the demographic prompts.
Yes. And critically, they did it without the inherent risks of essentializing identity or relying on potentially biased stereotypical data linked to those sensitive demographics.
Wow. So for some use cases, like just needing a broad range of ideas, there are other safer ways to prompt that might even be more effective at getting diverse ideas rather than diverse stereotypes.
That's a huge takeaway. It's a really important academic point they demonstrated empirically.
Yeah.
You can achieve the goal of R4 coverage without the ethical problems tied to demographic prompting.
You mentioned earlier the different reasons for prompting have different ethical weights. How did the study frame that side of things?
Yeah, they argue that the ethical seriousness, the normative consequence, as they put it, of using an LLM instead of a person is definitely highest for that R1 contingent case, where identity is fundamental to the truth being sought. Replacing someone sharing their lived experience there is the most deeply problematic.
Right.
They also mentioned, interestingly, that the negative effects, the misportrayal and flattening, seemed empirically weakest for the R3 subjective tasks in their study.
The annotation tasks.
Yeah. Which might suggest maybe, in very specific situations where human annotation is just prohibitively expensive, the harms could be less severe.
Yeah.
But they were still cautious.
Because the overall message is still one of extreme caution.
Absolutely. Because even with potential upsides like cost savings or convenience, the harms they documented, misportrayal, flattening, essentialization, are serious. And they're not easily fixed just by tweaking the current generation of models.
They're kind of baked into how they're trained right now.
Yes, pretty much. So the decision to use an LLM as a stand-in, especially for R1 or R2 reasons, really requires a tough ethical calculation. Do the benefits genuinely outweigh these serious harms, as the paper calls them, and the risk of contributing to those epistemic injustices?
And their study provides the strong evidence based on, what was it, over 3,000 human responses compared against 4 different LLMs using open-ended answers, multiple ways of measuring diversity.
Right, the free response data was key, much richer than prior multiple-choice studies. And using multiple metrics like SBERT, Jacquard, Venn scores, covariance, it makes the findings really robust. The evidence shows these problems are deep.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What are the absolute key takeaways you think people should remember from this deep dive into the Wang, Morgenstern, and Dickerson paper?
Okay, first, the big one. Current LLMs, powerful as they are, just can't accurately or ethically substitute for diverse human identities. It's not a small issue. It's rooted in their training data, lacking identity links, causing misportrayal, and their training goals rewarding averages, causing group flattening. Second, these technical flaws aren't just technical. They have real ethical weight. They risk perpetuating historical harms, speaking for others, flattening marginalized groups, and contributing to what we called epistemic injustice.
Okay.
And third,
while people are trying things, the easy fixes aren't really fixes. Using special names or tweaking temperature only gets you so far and can have downsides. The very act of prompting with identity can be harmful through essentialization. But, importantly, the study showed there are innovative alternatives for some goals, like using non-demographic prompts for R4 coverage.
so why does all this matter to you, the person listening right now?
Well, because you are almost certainly going to encounter claims or see applications where AI is supposedly being used to simulate human experiences or gather diverse perspectives.
It's becoming common. Exactly. And this study gives you the deep, academically grounded understanding to actually question those claims critically. It gives you the vocabulary, misportrayal, flattening, essentialization, and the evidence to challenge the assumption that LLMs can just easily stand in for complex human identity.
It really highlights the difference between simulation and reality.
It does. And this research powerfully reminds us about the value of authentic, lived experiences, the unique authority that comes from actually living something, what the authors call epistemic authority. That authority often gets lost or warped when you replace it with a model trained on data where lived experience is all mixed up with outside observations and stereotypes. So as AI gets better and cheaper, the really provocative thought maybe is this: how do we make sure this technology is used to lift up and amplify genuine human voices, especially those who've been historically pushed to the margins, rather than inadvertently replacing them with these potentially harmful, flattened simulations?
That is definitely something to think about. How do we keep the human in the loop and value that human experience, even as the technology races forward?
Exactly. This research pushes us to be really critical about who's missing from the data, whose voices are being amplified, and whose might be getting silenced.